Uh, we're going to shift now to the second panel.
Well, I'm from Michigan. I don't know whether I should say good morning or good afternoon. So wherever you are, I start with that. Greetings to all of you. I'm privileged to be part of this conversation and to be a moderator and a discussant for three great scholars. As I said, my name is Dr. Tababa Shete. I am the moderator and the discussant. I have three panelists with me for this session with their great, stimulating and thought-provoking papers. I present their names, institutional affiliations, and the title of their respective papers. I start with Dr. Professor Faoud Maki, Associate Professor of Developments, Sociology, Cornell University, Ithaca, USA, presenting Historicizing the Present, Contesting Culture and Power in Contemporary Ethiopia, followed by Professor Surafil Windemu Abebe, Assistant Professor at Center for African Studies and Researcher at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University. His paper, the paper is entitled Ethiopia, Epistemic and Material Violence, Unsettling Ethiopian Exceptionalism. Lastly, but not least, followed by Professor Shimalis Bonsa Gluma, Stony Brook University, New York, and his title would be Exceptionalism, Interrogating the Entangled Making of Modern Ethiopia.
Sorry, Professor, sorry.
Yeah.
So I think one participant is missing in here, Dr. Sarait Bakkala.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, so we have four. Hello?
Yes, we have four. And
okay.
I think the title and everything is in the booklet, I think.
Good. Thank you for reminding me. So we have four presenters. So all of these, each presenters will have from 15 to 20 minutes maximum. So I really want you to make an effective and beneficial use of your time so that we have plenty of time for discussions. At the end, I will make probably as required brief comments, and then the floor will be open for discussions. So our next speaker is Professor Surafil Windemu Abebe. I think I've already introduced him. For the interest of time, I invite you to present your paper.
Thank you so much. Again, in the interest of time, I would like to read what I've written. As the moderator told us, the title of my presentation today is Epistemic and Material or Embodied Violence, Unsettling Ethiopian Exceptionalisms. It is a reality that Ethiopian exceptionalism is a multi-pronged narrative that has informed progressive actions such as the anti-colonial struggle and its global resonance. Indeed, Ethiopians have endured and lived particular historical experiences. Yet it is time to ask what other realities have been glossed over and what other questions we are not asking due to the meta-narrative of Brikyoa, the unique, and Qኝ ያልተገዛች, uncolonized Ethiopia. Uncritical pan-Ethiopian discourse chiefly subscribes to Semitic origin that alienated what it invented as non-Abyssinian groups, as aliens, while it selectively remembers what it calls 3,000 years of untrammeled history. This story of exceptionalism, however, forgets any negation embedded in its own narrative. For instance, it does not acknowledge episodic contradictory histories, but imposes epic narration about uninterrupted history. Paradoxically enough, in its retaliation against such flattening pan-Ethiopian discourse, ethno-national narrative takes the former's uniqueness and its positivist theory and method for granted. In so doing, both nationalisms, the Pan-Ethiopian and ethno-nationalism, without losing sight of the fracture embedded within these categories, both nationalisms shatter possibilities of other utopias that account for inter and transsectional. By transsectional, I mean going beyond Eurocentrism and any kind of ethnocentrism, that account for inter and transsectional issues of capital, class, race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, caste, disability, age, and other important variables. To approach this problematic, I want to start with this question. How does Ethiopian historiography account for negligence of the discussion of colonial/modern theoretical and methodological imports rooted in history writing? This is an urgent question in that the current political predicament and discourses of Pan-Ethiopianism and ethnicity have been highly affected by the Hegelian and Rankian models of rationality. Even though official exceptionalism narratives and traditional history writing have camouflaged critical debates around inter-transsectionality, it was almost 100 years ago that Ethiopian critical thinkers such as Gabrehot Baykadany and Malaku Bayan questioned Ethiopia's independence or its uncolonized status. While he advocated for learning from Europe's technological modernization, Gabrehot cautioned his fellow Ethiopians to educate their children, arguing that the physical infrastructure Ethiopia had to build would otherwise benefit the French or the white man unless one had to take building knowledge infrastructure seriously. Cognizant of his conditions, Gabrehot then asked this important question, quote, "Can we say that we Ethiopians have independence?" unquote, despite Ethiopia's victory over colonialism? His answer was negative. In his view, there is no independence without self-sufficiency. Given that he begged such a question in the wake of the Adwa victory over colonialist Italy in 1896, I would say that Gabrehot had already tried to understand Ethiopian experiences, not only based on his concern about the looming colonialism, but also in light of coloniality, meaning pointing to the state of being colonized without losing political independence. Nevertheless, Gabrehot's contempt for women and certain ethnic groups are untenable. For instance, while his contemporary Deresa Amante, who came from an Oromo society, was reflecting on the condition of modernity in Birhanna Salam newspaper along with him, Gabrehot condemned the Oromos as people with inferior knowledge. Gabrehot critiqued hierarchical global relations while he reified exclusionary logic when it comes to internal imperial relation in Ethiopia. I keep the tension between his critical gesture towards Ethiopian exceptionalism as uncolonized or independent country in view of global capital on the one hand, and his contempt to non-Abyssinian peoples and women on the other. This leads me to bring forth issues of epistemic colonization, particularly reproduction of colonial/modern historiography and politics of nationalisms that wreak havoc on the mundane everyday life as we speak now. Then let me discuss coloniality of historiography. I mean, history as a profession and as a discipline. Although there had been layers that the so-called explorers already built up, insofar as modern history writing is concerned, one could trace the invention of Ethiopia as a racially exceptional ancient empire in Hegel's conception of history. According to Hegel, Egypt does not just have history, but a long history that, quote, reaches to 2,207 years before Christ, end quote. It seems that Hegel even assigns a more historical and cultural value to Ethiopia when he says Egypt, quote, probably received its culture from Ethiopia, end quote. For Hegel, Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit, still involved in the conditions of mere nature, or what M.S. Cesar called, thingification, thingness. And the historical movement that he talks about, that Hegel talks about, Egypt and Ethiopia, is not of African spirit, but that of what he calls Asiatic or European world. Neither part of Black Africa, nor family of white Europe, Ethiopia figured in Hegel's thinking as an enigma. The excess he puts into Ethiopia's historical value in relation to what he calls the dark continent appears to be seductive, while the lack he assigns to this country, Ethiopia, in relation to Europe is repulsive. Coupled with Hegel's notion of, quote, progressive movement on the world historical stage, end quote, the enigmatic space that Ethiopia inhabits has been a major conundrum that Ethiopian history writing has to think through. Indeed, the Rankian idea that every stage of history must be judged as an end in itself, as it has happened, complicates the historiographic problem that fuels preservation of status quo and unethical articulation of freedom. This calls for examining history as an epistemic and embodied problematic. Foreign or local, conventional historiographers have been writing that Ethiopia has severely suffered from what they call the burden of history. Suffice it to mention three of them here. In 2002, Alessandro Truilzi used the phrase burden of history in his critique of existing competing nationalisms in Ethiopia. Paradoxically enough, in 1994, Adhana Haile Adhana, a professional historian come politician, argued for kind of primordial identity politics, conjuring up burden of the past that measured alienation in terms of expulsion from ancient Abyssinian pedigree or usurpation and control of power by what he calls Shoa dynasty that shifted authority from the Amhara, Tigray, Agao tripartite imperium. Adhana borrowed the term from Shezrau Ezman, who represented Ethiopia in 1963 as an anomaly that was caught in Africa, but not of Africa, end quote, because it was encumbered by what Ezman calls historical burden, which in his view hindered the country from being contemporary with modern world. I argue that in these lines of thinking, history has been thought of as a thing of the past, whose duress is mostly measured in terms of accumulated empty time, than a colonial/modern theory that produced a positivist methodology. Despite the sporadic emergent critical engagements, Eurocentric historiographical procedures continue to be dominant in Ethiopia, in Ethiopian professional history writing. However, as Arif Dirlik reminds us, critique of Eurocentrism is not enough in a world where Eurocentric views have been internalized so much so that sheer identity politics obfuscates and makes impossible to unsettle the workings of global capital. For instance, the Semitic history pursued by uncritical Pan-Ethiopianists, those who argue for greater Ethiopia based on 3,000 years of untrammeled history, by alienating what they invented as the non-Semitic other, and politics of autochthony, advanced by ethno-nationalist scholars, those who question the former while they essentialize ethnic identity by foreignizing what they invented as the non-Cushitic other, reify one another's logic and method. Marxian history writing that accounts for the national, class, and gender question, though it usually delays the gender question, suffers from similar, if not the same kind of historiographic problems, since it follows Rankian procedures of archival research and history writing, and its dialectics is limited to temporality, as it does not account itself for the question of space or spatialization. As a result, all sees the burden of history as an accumulated homogeneous time that encumbers the present without attending to the ways in which the past has been made intelligible in the present moment. Many professional and public historians too, see the burden in Ethiopian historiography less as an inherently problematic issue embedded in history as a profession and discipline, as a rest, gendered, sexed, classed, and imperial discipline, which has got its own historical formation. Rather, they view history as sheer temporality, as Agamben and David Scott tell us. I argue that these writers measure only the burden of the past time/history on the present than rethinking the conventional philosophy of history as an epistemic and embodied burden. In other words, they see history in terms of abstraction of reality, just as a change in time, than as placement and displacement or question of spatiality, temporality, and embodied social relations. Since Hegelian historiography depicts Black bodies in terms of lag in time and lack in space, it is vital to historicize and spatialize at once. If such a proposition is tangible, I can respond to F.R. Anker Smith's call to, quote, think about the past rather than investigate it, end quote, by paying attention to meaning rather than reconstruction and genesis. When we reconstruct and look for genesis, what we have is, for instance, in the politics around Addis Ababa, what we find in this kind of history writing is either Finfinne or Barara. We don't account for the multifarious chaotic relationships and movements across time and across space. Thinking about the past starts from catching fragments from the past that circulate in the here and the now. Therefore, one has to understand the conditions that inform the formation of today's identity politics, concealment of neoliberal structuring, and production of gendered and sexed subjectivities that hinge on misrepresentation of the past in the present. Though my view is not presentist, in a sense that the past is abundant to be exploited by the present manipulation, I would say, following James Baldwin, that history is about the present as much as it is present in our bodies. Baldwin allows us to see history as an embodied experience that we carry within us in the present, and as, quote, our frames of reference, our identities and aspirations, unquote. Yet Baldwin does not see history as eternally endowed with tyrannical power, but as an idea and lived experience that can change through recreating oneself according to what he calls a principle more humane and liberating. I have almost finished it. In a world riddled with necroeconomy, as I pointed it out in my introductory remark, in a world riddled with necroeconomy, which is, according to Fatmir Haskaj, quote, a logic of capital that posits death as central activity of value creation, unquote, and punctured by what I call necroepistemology, meaning renunciation of any utopia other than neoliberal desires. Decolonization of historiography is vital for unsettling violent colonial, modern, theoretical and methodological imports, as it helps us as a mode of thought and ethical action to envision multiple better human utopias. Thank you so much. I've finished.
Thank you so much for staying on track.
Thank you.
So, yeah, exactly. You still have about 2 minutes even. Thank you for that. And then I will call upon the third speaker, Professor Shimelis Bonsa. Now, this is your time. You still have about 20 minutes. So,
sorry,
all
Professor.
yours. Yep.
I apologize for the interruption, but I would like to please present the fourth speaker, who is Sarawit Bekele Debele,
Yeah. Yeah.
who is the postdoctoral research fellow at the Max Planck Institute
Yeah.
for the study of religious and ethnic diversity in Germany.
Should he be the third speaker?
No, she can be the fourth speaker according to the schedule. And the title of her work is
Yeah, I have it. I have it here.
Oh, okay.
I have it here. Yep, of course, I have it here.
Okay.
I have it here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and please continue with the panel.
So this is reading, if you know, correct me, reading about Tobias troubling the Ethiopian imagination.
Yes, exactly.
That's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I have that at the last speaker.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Appreciate you. So, Professor Shimelis, take the podium. It's all yours. 20 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Taweba. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of the conference, the African Institute, the director, Professor Salah, and Satan for all the logistic work. And then Professors Elizabeth, Surafel, and sorry,
Dagmai,
yes. Dagmai, Surafel, and Elizabeth for the organizing for the conference. I thank all of them for the opportunity to present my working paper on history and the complicated construction of modern Ethiopia. My paper is organized in the following ways. There is an introductory part, and then there is a section on the making of modern Ethiopia. And then there is the last part, is a discussion about the crisis of analysis, with a focus on two important ideas, theoretical frameworks that organize the contemporary intellectual political discourse in Ethiopia. One is the idea of exceptionalism, and the other is this binary structure that has defined intellectual political discussions, conversations in Ethiopia, especially over the last 20 or so years. So what I will do is, just like my earlier colleague, Siraj did, is to read, not all of it, but part of the paper. I would leave out the discussion about the making of modern Ethiopia, because it has been discussed in many ways. So I will only focus on the crisis of analysis. So I will start now. In May 2014, a small protest began in a place called Ambo, a provincial town located some 120 kilometers west of Addis Ababa. And the protest and many others that followed over the years, in the following 4 years, was directed against a decision by the Addis Ababa municipality to extend the physical boundaries of the city. The proposed aerial expansion would have extended the boundaries of the city by about 100 kilometers, representing a 24-day expansion of the city, all at the expense of towns and villages in the Oromia region of the state. The protest would continue for the following 4 years, leading to the deaths of hundreds of people, mostly young, the imprisonment of tens of thousands, and the destruction of property. The regional protest would eventually become a nationwide resistance against the government, and only subsided with the appointment in April 2018 of a reformist prime minister from Oromia, the epicenter of the resistance. The protest was also, it should also be seen as a popular reaction to larger questions of identity, belonging, citizenship, and global capital. The protest as such was not just against the city or the nation state that many saw as parasitic and marginalizing, but also the neoliberal order which the state embraced, albeit reluctantly, since 2005. The issues at hand are who owns and belongs in the city and the nation at large, and who is not, who has a right and who hasn't, and who gains and loses from the material dominance of the city in its place in the global capitalist economy. The protest is, in a way, the latest manifestation of a long genealogy of protests against the Ethiopian state. A deep analysis shows that resistance was similar in its content to the protests of the past, especially of the 1960s. But the language of the protest and the way it was cast and launched signaled the growing saliency of identity politics. It can therefore be said that the protests in general were fundamentally economic in origin, but were often conveyed in the emotive language of ethnicity, which was instrumentalized to organize and mobilize the public. If in the past issues of class and economy were paramount, there is now a growing convergence between class and ethnicity, which creates a socially, politically combustible condition in the country today. In short, what was being questioned is Ethiopia's and its capital city's cultural and political identity and its place in the world. What the protest signified is a crisis of Ethiopia's modernist endeavor and the century-old project of city and nation building. The answers to these questions are rooted in the history of the city and the nation, especially their contested origins, and the political economies that organize and shape their development. So what follows is a discussion about the complicated making of modern Ethiopia, but I'm not going into that discussion. So instead, I will go straight to a discussion about the crisis of analysis. The awakening in 2018 that attended the arrival of a new group of leadership in the country in February in 2018 has created a sense of optimism and a belief in the possibilities for a turnaround. At the same time, the last 2 years have once again laid bare Ethiopia's deep features and its complex challenge. Now is the time, I think the right time to ask questions, examine our complicated experiences, and confront Ethiopia's inconvenient truths, and build on the legacy of the fight for economic and social justice. Ethiopia's current crisis is created and is created. It is not natural. It is created and has a genealogy that goes back to the rise of the modern Ethiopia. Shaping Ethiopia's future, especially in a context of intensely divisive discourses and politics, requires a critical interrogation of what we have dreamt and achieved and what went wrong, at least in the last 50 or so years. In particular, we need to re-examine the kind of questions we've been asking, the interpretive frameworks and concepts we have deployed, and whether they were grounded in a deeper understanding of Ethiopia's conditions, its complicated histories, traditions, and experiences. The call for a new epistemic engagement comes from the recognition that there is a crisis with intellectual practice today, which largely is rooted in its deep Eurocentric upbringing and reflected in its deeply problematic interrogation of the Ethiopian condition. We need to liberate discussions that are often constrained by the use of concepts and frameworks that are theoretically sterile or impoverished and politically constraining. So what is needed, therefore, is knowledge and a fundamental rethink or review of how we know what we know about Ethiopia and its predicaments. Such a critical practice allows for a different and better intellectual and political imagination. So let's begin with a critique of the notion of Ethiopian exceptionalism and then the analytical frameworks or the theoretical containers used in the interrogation of the Ethiopian conditions in the 1960s. So the first one is exceptionalism. So my title is Beyond Exceptionalism. The notion of exceptionalism is given a pride of place, shaping Ethiopian imagination, informing foreign imagination of the country, and organizing intellectual and political practice about the country, especially in the 20th century. Ethiopia's peculiarity, at least in Africa, has to do with its claim to exceptional history as a country with a distinct historical experience, which is partly a result of its location at the crossroads of multiple influences from within and without, the latter including African, Asian, Middle Eastern, Indian, and the European inspirations. One can argue that the idea of Ethiopia, or the modern idea of Ethiopia, is a product not just of Ethiopian imagination, but also imaginations from other areas, the Western world in particular. There is in fact a convergence between a Eurocentric conception of Ethiopia and Ethiopia's Semiticist great tradition, both placing the country on a pedestal of exceptionalism as a place in rather than of Africa, a Black Caucasian distinct from and better than the rest of Africa, if not Europe. Ethiopia, or at least its leaders, saw itself and was seen by many others, the West included, through a paradigm of difference, even as a separate civilization in space. Its great tradition enshrined in the Covenant and other documents and its annual victory were deployed as instruments of validation. The epistemic and material implications of this creative imagination are very profound. Ethiopian exceptionalism claim to exceptionalism raises more questions than answers, but the critique of its ideological cultural premises and practices should not drain its epistemic possibilities, for instance, as a foundation for an alternative and counter-hegemonic narrative. The singularity narrative has the potential to open up new avenues to interrogate and resist hegemonic paradigms. For instance, the West and its Eurocentric assumptions and its universalist claims. One example is the Ethiopian critique of the West, its search for alternative modernity or attempts to negotiate Europe's colonial colonizing modernity. An early representative of this mode of thought is Nagadras Gerrit Baikirang. I think Surafil talked about him. About the significance, the epistemic significance of Nagadras Gerrit's interventions and the limits of his interventions, his intellectual practice. At the same time, we need to ask what the meta-narrative of exceptionalism has done to us, not just for us. What kind of questions and thoughts has it concealed from us in questions that are embedded, deeply entrenched in institutions and the structures? Has this idea of exceptionalism given us or denied us the ability to ask those questions, interrogate those thoughts, including thoughts that were sexist and patriarchal or even racist? A deeper interrogation of Ethiopian exceptionalism exposes its complicity with tyrannical power and the consequence of tyranny. The notion of singularity, which simultaneously includes and excludes, is empowering, but also subjugating. Singularity often slips into ideas of manifest destiny and civilizing mission, which are very similar in some ways to the civilizing mission of the West. So one cannot help but notice how current discourses, especially on social media, on questions of Ethiopia's cultural identity and belonging, tap into these deeply sedimented stories and narratives of exceptionalism. Let's briefly elaborate on what the narrative of exceptionalism signifies, especially in the context of contemporary Ethiopian politics and discourse. It has been argued that Ethiopian exceptionalism is fundamentally the exceptionalism of highland Judeo-Christian Semitic-speaking Ethiopia, the region and culture which is constructed as the bedrock of Ethiopian civilization. Such a culturized political imagining and construction of Ethiopia is implicated in otherizing, concealing the rest of the country, their cultures, their histories, traditions, and knowledge. A cultural bifurcation of Ethiopia into a civilized north and a backward south which localizes a global cultural division between the West and the West, informs and legitimates the current politics of autochthony or indigeneity, in which people are divided into indigene and or native, Nabbar, versus strangers or Sardas, Safari. Interestingly, reverse discourses, which as representatives of marginalized communities claim to be counter-hegemonic, use the same logic and language and reproduce the same binaries and exclusions. Contemporary Ethiopia is littered with evidence of this kind of violence, embodied violence such as simplistic opposition entails or enables in the form of the demonization, marginalization, displacement, and killing of people considered different or alien or at times animalized beings in a way very unnervingly reminiscent of Rwanda on the road to the genocide. Externally, the narrative of Ethiopian exceptionalism led to an ambivalent and complicated entanglement with the world, both the global south, notably Africa and the West. This is evident in Ethiopia's simultaneous embrace and rejection of the world, its incoherent dependence, its incomplete independence, and its insulation from crucial discussions of colonialism and the coloniality of knowledge production, and through them issues of poverty, inequality, global capital, and neoliberalism. While recognizing the existence of a long tradition of critical inquiry going back to the early 20th century, the lack of sustained and deep conversation between and within Ethiopian scholars and the scholars from the global south, particularly Africa, has impoverished intellectual and political practice in Ethiopia. There are a number of ways to interpret the contradictions of Ethiopia's claim to singularity and its epistemic withdrawal from decolonial inquiries and simultaneous dependence and rejection of the West. One example is the fundamentals of modern Ethiopia's historical constitution through an ambivalent and complicated negotiation ways rather than instead of global capital. What shaped the development trajectory of modern Ethiopia are its marginal location in the global economy and its encounter with the colonial experience, all in spite of its claim to exceptionalism. The brutal reality is Ethiopia's independence is circumscribed, and its complicated development takes place under a constant, often seductive and subjugating gaze of global capitalism and capitalist modernity. So what should we do? While underscoring the historical specificity of the Ethiopian experience embedded in the idea of exceptionalism, one can argue that there is a need of an urgency for Ethiopia to go beyond or liberate itself from the paradigm of exceptionalism. This, in short, means to decolonize its system of knowledge production. Such an option entails decoupling Ethiopian scholarship from its Eurocentric Semiticist inheritance and reconnecting it with critical subaltern post-colonial conversations, including post-colonial African studies. A quest for this kind of intellectual practice is an ambitious objective, but one that is not that is of critical importance. What Ethiopian scholarship needs is more than overcoming its Orientalist Semiticist birthmarks, but more importantly, the historicist philosophy, its understanding of history that structures and legitimates this kind of intellectual activity. The crucial questions include the very idea of history and the historiography. So I hope I have a few more minutes, right?
Yep.
Maybe 10 minutes?
Still have, yeah.
Thank you.
2 minutes, yeah.
2 minutes, oh, okay. So I will go to the discussion about binaries, so the beyond binaries. The quest for a new epistemic structure or a new kind of knowledge production involves addressing an intellectual crisis of another kind, and that is the binaries and the homogenization of discourses in which single narratives become hegemonic, assuming the force of truth while eliding other truths and memories and histories. Discourses constructed as such and informing and legitimating political practice is the germ of Ethiopia's current predicament and the source of its precariousness. To homogenize is to produce a one-dimensional narrative, which is a deeply authoritarian political and intellectual endeavor. The evidence is none other than Ethiopia's intensely polarized and somewhat convoluted politics, beginning in the 1960s and the 70s, but continuing to this day. Since 1991, for instance, ethnicity is empowered as the single most important framework to order and legitimate Ethiopian politics and political participation. The implications are colossal. To begin with, privileging ethnicity, and the ethnicity of the father at that, as only marker of identity, pivotal for citizenship and politics, enchains patriarchy and marginalizes other equally important frameworks and categories with which people define themselves and organize their social political lives. Ethiopians, especially Ethiopians, those who subscribe to non-ethnic and cosmopolitan identifications, are put in danger of being disenfranchised with limited access to the political process. Giving precedence to a primordial definition of ethnicity engenders another understanding of ethnicity that ignores the social and historical constitution of identity and its unbounded, overlapping, and malleable nature. Such an objectivist conception of ethnic groups as fixed entities or primordial givens ignores the flux in ethnic identification. The result is erasure of people with mixed ancestry while imposing intra and inter-ethnic homogeneity at the expense of rich multiplicity of such affinities and affiliations. On the other hand, the same argument of homogenizing primordialism applies to other equally powerful categories of articulation such as nation, nationalism, and the civic ethnic variations of nationalism. More often, nation and nationalism are constructed as two distinct, bounded, fixed categories, organized around notions of organic and inorganic, liberal and illiberal, civic and ethnic oppositions. Such binaries represent an attempt by scholars, not least political elites, to conceptualize or organize a complex world through a simplistic prism into a monochrome of races and ethnicities. In Ethiopia, the nation is rendered primordial, often using the language of immutability.
I think your time is up, Professor Shimalis.
Okay.
Yeah. Should I give you 1 minute just to finish?
Okay, so let me, the last part, I think, okay, a few sections, there is a paragraph, let me read it. An alternative intellectual, so in both cases, what I'm asking, what I'm calling for is a new intellectual political imagination, which needs a new kind of envisioning. That is critical. And a history, the past, in particular, Ethiopian past, can serve as a guide in this important endeavor. And the way it is recovered, meaning history of the past, interpreted and applied matters. As I wrote elsewhere, a radical reading of Ethiopia as a coherent entity risks the danger of homogenizing the nation's diverse histories and experiences. An extreme interpretation of the notion of plurality, on the other hand, complicates the task of making sense of the nation. The challenge is what kind of history to write. One that subsumes complexity in the heterogeneity under a single dominant national history, or one that fragments a shared history into the experience of bounded and separate groups. A way out would be to decompartmentalize discussions of Ethiopia to show how its constituent parts are all tied in a complex wave of interdependence and relationships. Such an understanding valorizes the specificities of local experiences while constructing a composite nationalism, national identity, and history. I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate it. And then, of course, the last speaker, not the least, is Professor Sarawit Bekele.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Germany, and thank you all, the organizers, for a great conference, and thank you for making me part of that. So what I try to do today in this presentation is try to read Tobia, the first Amharic novel, from a kind of a different perspective that centers female protagonists. That's Tobia. So I'll just quickly read my paper. So I intend to read, or perhaps reread, the first Amharic novel, Tobia, with some speculative questions that I hope will generate productive tensions about the way in which Ethiopia is imagined. Tobia was authored by Afwork Gabraselassie and published in 1911 in Rome. At face value, it reads as a story of a Christian family in destitute, in particular of a father and his twin children, Wahed and Tobia, a family in constant search of reunion. And yet, Jonas Admasu sees beyond the story of a Christian family and posits it as Ethiopia's contemporary foundational myth. He states that the novel picks off from where Kubra-Nagast lives and yet departs from Kubra-Nagast in significant ways. While Tobia and Kubra-Nagast were generated in times of trouble to offer a resolution for social conflicts, Tobia imagines that possibility through fraternity instead of what Kubra-Nagast does, that is aggressivity. Whereas Kubra-Nagast historicizes a mythical past, Tobia fictionalizes it. Focusing on two tropes, Jonas focuses on these two tropes, disruption and harmony. Ethiopia is imagined in Tobia as one in which its diverse communities live in harmony, despite Anders Orthodox Christian moral and ethical values. Jonas also writes that the resolution to the social conflicts is imagined and narrated through a tinted glass of a Christian citizen. As Jonas himself points out, the novel defies categorization, a useful quality, I believe, that allows for reading it as myth, legend, adventure, romance, fantasy, all put together. Now, for the work I'm trying to do here, I stress on romance to foreground the intertwinement of empire building, or perhaps rebuilding, and intimacy. I also stress fantasy to think about the king's attraction to Tobia, the main protagonist, even when she is disguised as a boy, up until the need to disclose that secret arose. Now, I would argue that the novel is a literary production useful in rethinking other possibilities to imagine the Ethiopian polity apart from or in addition to religion and ethnicity. For this, I ask what it looks like to read Tobia and through it, the idea of Ethiopia in the lens of a female Christian citizen with ambivalent gender and sexual identities. Now, let me just quickly give a short synopsis of Tobia before I share my thoughts. So while agreeing with Jonas Admasu's three plots in the development of the story, I add a fourth one to emphasize the way in which the desire for intimacy shapes the ending of the story with the aspired harmony within the framework of the Christian moral values. The book begins with narrating a destructive battle in which Christians lost. Out of the four Christian war generals, 3 were killed, while 1 was captured and sold into slavery. The story in this stage revolves around what the captive's family goes through to find him. The family receives a message that says they should pay ransom to get the general back. That's the general being their father. They asked those who captured him, asked an exaggerated amount of gold, and the war general's family decided to try anyway and divided tasks amongst themselves to that effect. This is at the point at which the son Wahid goes to sell his labor. Wahid's delicate body makes it obvious that he is not used to the kind of hard work he offered to do. In any case, he went ahead and approached a person to hire Wahid, but approached a person to give Wahid a job as a caravan. But the merchant declined to hire Wahid, but offered him 30 ounces of gold. Now Wahid went back home with a gift. This was followed by the father showing up soon after, which leaves the family wonder how that happened. But Wahid realized immediately that the merchant who gave him the gold must have helped get his father home. Stage 2 begins when Wahid decides to look for the man to express his gratitude. But Wahid did not know where the benevolent man lives. Days passed by without finding the traces of the merchant. Before he could find the merchant, Wahid was captured and sold into slavery by the infidels. Now Wahid's family waited for some time, but he did not return home. The father then decides to leave home in search of his only son. His twin sister, Tobia, insists on accompanying her father, but her parents reject her absurd proposal. And yet, Tobia goes on and convinces her parents by suggesting that she can disguise herself as a boy and nobody will know. It will also, that's Tobia's suggestion, make the horse ride easier if she dressed like a boy. Now her father agrees and they begin the journey to look for Wahid. Stage 3 takes us through this journey, the journey of the father and Tobia to look for Wahid. Now, despite that it started as an easy one, the journey became dangerous just when they crossed a territory that was being ravaged by the infidels, who were destroying everything they find and killing all the Christians. Scared for their life, Tobia and her father hide, but only to be spotted immediately. Yet the unusually kind for an infidel king invading Christians, the king met them right before they became prey to the ravaging force of the invaders. Granted his protection, Tobia and her father stick with the king and return with him to his kingdom. Stage 4 revolves around everything that happens while Tobia and her father were under the king's protection. Now here at the fourth stage, 2 central themes stand out: the mission to find Wahid and the slowly unfolding attractions of both the king and his female cousins to Tobia. The king promises to help them find Wahid and the benevolent merchant. He also gives a place, both the father and Tobia, a place to stay and work to do. As time goes by, the king struggles with his attractions to Tobia. He helplessly gave in to his feelings, irrespective of the fact that Tobia is a boy, or so she appeared. A day does not go by without the king trying to find a way to see Tobia. Now, fast forward, the king eventually finds out that Tobia is a girl. Due to a plot, her workmates set accusing her of behaving inappropriately around the king's female cousin, who also loves Tobia. Now, frightened upon hearing the false accusation, Tobia and her father summon the king to disclose that Tobia cannot have anything to do with his cousin, as she is herself a female. Finding out that Tobia is a female gives the king the relief and courage to ask her for marriage. She decides against the proposal on grounds that she is a Christian and cannot marry an infidel, no matter how good he is as a person. Now, because he loves her so much, he agrees to convert and they marry. The story ends with the restoration of the Christian kingdom, adding more members because the infidels in his kingdom also convert. Now, their wedding seals the redemption or restoration of the Christian empire, where disruption ends and harmony reigns. This, in a way, speaks to some of the current debates in Ethiopia about who genuinely belongs in the polity and on what condition. What Obia reveals is that difference is subdued through the act of forced assimilation. The king's desire for love and intimacy are deployed as mediums through which restoration of the Christian empire are made possible. So accepting certain values such as Christianity were conditions for inserting oneself to imperial systems of rule. This means that harmony is imagined in the novel, or harmony as imagined in the novel is predicated on subsuming diversity under Christian values. Even though Obia appears to be revolutionary in many ways, as I come back to it in the next sections, the novel still follows the route of continuity by valorizing certain dominant values. Now here lies Ethiopia's continuity through a Christian religious ideology, and along with it, the narrative of exceptionalism, to which the Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity is central. But yet, Obia offers us an additional lens, or lenses, if you will, through which we can imagine the nation. But this requires centering Obia, her ambivalent gender identity, and the ways in which love and intimacy work. Now, based on this premise, here are my preliminary thoughts to explore these possibilities of for grounding Obia in love and intimacy, to think about or imagining, to start imagining Ethiopia anew. First, now this is preliminary thought number one. The protagonist Obia becomes central in redeeming the Christian kingdom in the acts of setting out to look forward with her father. Through her attempts to be part of restoring a family, which is central for empire, we imagine the restoration of the Christian kingdom because the family and its cohesion are central for imperial formation. But more crucially, Obia brings in an important twist through her encounter with the king. By asserting that she will not marry an infidel, Obia becomes central in the making or breaking of that Christian empire. It becomes apparent in the novel that if it were not for the king's attraction to Obia, her initial resistance to marry an unbeliever and his readiness to convert, Christian Ethiopia and its restoration would not have been possible. Now, this means that Afroc's Obia is not a woman who simply gives in to the seductions of power and privilege or flows along with what has been prescribed for her. She's a woman with a mind and decision of her own. Now, to be sure, she, along with her new husband, becomes the bearers of Christianity as a central pillar of imagining the nation or imagination. Christianity is a moral code the couple embodies and transmits to the unconverted and pass it on to the future. Whether through war or moral superiority, Christian religious ideology remains to be the dominant organizer of the political life of the kingdom. But in Obia, love, not military might, is central in restoring that kingdom that has been disintegrated. The will of God is manifested not through victory by aggression, but through intimacy or the desire for it. Intimacy brings about the harmony, the traveled time needed. Traveled time is the notion Jonas Adamasu uses in his reading of Obia. And by bridging the cleavages created due to continuous social conflicts, mostly between infidels and Christians. The author, Afrok, played with the idea of an unstable body, love, and intimacies that construct identities of both the protagonists and the empire within the framework of dominant religious belief. Thus, national imagery is constructed by the very process that gives rise to the sex and gender identities at play. Preliminary thought number two. What makes Obia even more interesting is that she defies the typical place of women as agents of reproduction or caregivers confined within the private domain. The moment she leaves home, her engagement revolves around reassembling an otherwise disintegrating empire. The author leaves it to our imagination, deliberately or not, by limiting his narrative to the wedding, and we do not get to see Obeah being tasked with childbearing for the kingdom. Furthermore, even though modesty and chastity are Obeah's important attributes, we do not get confronted with incidents that overtly fit the conventional representation of women in nationalist discourses. Instead of being imagined as the king's appendage or in relation to her role in social reproduction, Obeah takes a more proactive role as someone whose decision is crucial to the course the empire takes. The novel creates women as agents who set the ultimate condition on which relies the becoming of the Christian kingdom. The wife is redefined in her role, not as secondary, but as the only necessary condition for the restoration. Also, unlike other foundational myths, Obeah does not necessarily naturalize and or solidify masculinity and femininity, nor does the novel prescribe strictly normative ways of sexual desire or attraction. This becomes visible when we look at the fluidity of Obeah's identity in the king's consistent attraction towards her. She becomes an ambivalent character when we see her through the eyes of the young, handsome, and humble king. The king's desire seems to ignore or perhaps even build on her ambivalence. He likes her even when he was not quite sure where to place her within the binary of a boy-girl. Obeah operates in the spaces of the in-between and thereby troubles the binary of what it is to be a man and a woman. However, at the same time, Obeah is made to marginalize her desire for intimacy in the interest of a higher purpose, that is, the Christian empire, which she represents, expresses, embodies, and anticipates to become. Even if we assume she were equally attracted to the king, she refused to indulge that thought for what she believed is a higher and more noble cause. Preliminary thought 3. The protagonist Obeah breaks historical continuity while at the same time reifying it or perpetuating it. Obeah travels history because she redefines the role and agency of women in nationalist discourses and the foundational myths from which they emerge. For instance, what we see in Kubranegas is that the Queen Sheba leaves the scene the moment Minilik first comes to take over as a king. Although she was the queen up until Minilik's arrival, she exits the throne through motherhood. On the contrary, Obeah inserts herself into the work of empire's restoration by setting the terms on which it could actually happen. But through these very revolutionary acts that seem to travel history, she embodies continuity of the empire's history by disallowing a non-Christian to enter unless converted. Even if he is accepting of her and her father, even if he's kind and protective, even if he kept his promises to them, even if the father and the daughter were overwhelmed by his mercifulness, no amount of righteousness was enough until he accepted Christianity. So he was subjected to perpetuating a Christian empire and its history. But for the king, it seems it's much less about maintaining power. It was not for fostering alliances with a potential threat, but it was love. He gets portrayed.
I'm sorry to intervene. You have about probably 2 minutes, so I want you to wrap it up, given.
Okay, yeah.
Sure.
He gets portrayed as a helpless romantic who abandons his faith and forces his subjects to do the same. Indeed, this needs to be situated within the context of the intentions of the author the author being Afroc, for a newly born nation that to an extent departs from the old ways of achieving it through blood and iron. It's obvious that Afroc wanted to show us another dimension of how the empire relies on Christianity as the conquering religion. regardless of the desperation in which the kingdom and its Christian members found themselves. They are still made to rise and conquer, but now through the instrumentality of love and intimacy that the king and Ethiopia embodied. Now, in the words of Jonas Admasu, the glory or greatness of Afro's Ethiopia lies in the harmony of its citizens, diverse people living at peace with each other despite cultural or religious differences. This is what Jonas says. However, Obia's Ethiopia seems to be far removed, in my view, from the imagination, as it still centers Christianity as a sole organizing category. What Obia gives us is a perspective that foregrounds women's subjectivity in the remaking of empire in the sad time of trouble. Obia's trajectory invites an assessment of women's political subjectivity in Ethiopia, in today's Ethiopia, where their historical struggles are reduced to questions of representation in the existing political structure. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Well, the speakers have given us, I think, very stimulating and thought-provoking ideas. I will have to say that I do not pretend to have captured all of the contents of the papers that have been presented, but I would have to make the following summaries, and then I will leave it for the rest of you to interact. Again, I want to make this disclaimer that I do not want to bias or encumber the audience by layering my own thoughts or imposing in any of the presentations ideas and thoughts. It's their own. But having said that, instead of commenting and speaking on each person's on each presentation, I would have to summarize all of them in one bigger idea. So the speakers may have different aspects of the issue, but if I have to condense them, one or the other, they fall under the following categories. One, re-examining the notion of exceptionalism and what they have identified as meta-narrative of Ethiopian history. Two, a revision of the making, production, communications, and distribution of the knowledge of Ethiopian history. Three, the contestation over history, memory in contemporary Ethiopia, admitting that. Four, the need for a nuanced conceptualization of the contestedness and the complexity of the very meaning of Ethiopia. Five, these things may overlap one with one another, that's okay. The questioning of standardized narratives. Six, a call for a comprehensive history of the nation of Ethiopia that's inclusive enough, incorporating the voices, spaces of those who have not received official representation in the past. 6 or 7, I'm not even counting them. The re-examination of the claim of Ethiopia being a unique in terms of its conception of possessing a unique history of independence, as Surafel called it, Professor Surafel, which of course involves a huge epistemological burden on scholars who are trying to grapple with this issue, especially with the current dynamics of Ethiopia, where different ethnic groups are seeking to reimagine, to rethink, as Professor Schimmel pointed out, history from a revisionist point of view, whatever that means to all of us. That's what I call epistemological burden, investigating what other realities have been glossed over and what other questions we are not asking due to the meta-narrative, or again, to use Surafel's words, this Brkiye. I think it's an Amharic concept for exceptionalism, I think, to my understanding. And then, of course, Professor Schimmel has pointed out, given the seriousness of this discussion, of course, it's incumbent upon us to question many, many narratives in different ways and from different perspectives. And then he particularly he particularly points to the fact that with this change of leadership about 2 years ago, we have these new vistas of opportunities to re-examine, to reimagine, and engage in a very constructive, not destructive way, or re-engage our history in such a way that even if it's not attainable to have a unified history, because the attempt is, to kind of deconstruct this meta-narrative, but a history that is inclusive enough, comprehensive enough, allowing the spaces for those who have never had a chance in the past, and then, of course, creating not a meta-narrative, but a history that will be, inclusive enough, comprehensive enough, where the engagement level has a higher moral ground. I think with this, I will need to stop, and then I will leave the rest of the time for participants to ask questions to the respective individuals, to the respective professors. But I want to remind participants, to be very brief and very clear, and then direct your questions to the concerned, professor based on their presentations. Thank you.
If you can hear me, there is a question.
Yes.
To Professor Serawet. What do you make of the fact that non-normative gender and sexual identity arise before the conversion of the king? Did you hear me? Sorry?
I did. I'm thinking.
Okay, okay.
Okay. I'm not sure I understood the question. What do you make of the fact that non-normative gender and sexual identity arrives? Why do we think it arrived?
The conversion of the king.
Yeah, I don't understand the arrival of the term arrival. Is it not a process? Is it not part of the lived reality? Why do we think of it as arrival? I'm not sure if I understood the question.
Okay,
Can we let Edom speak, maybe?
Yeah, maybe if she can break it down a bit, or because I'm not sure what arrival means in this sense.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When you described the narrative of the novel, I haven't read it, so it just appeared that the moment of non-normative gender identity in the narrative happens before conversion to Christianity. So I'm just trying to get a sense about, I understand what you're doing about trying to use that moment to open up a different version of Ethiopianism. But what I'm asking is, if in the narrative, the moment of non-normativity arrives or emerges in the narrative before the moment of conversion and the moment of imperial consolidation, is there this disaggregation of a moment of political instability that generates non-fluid gender identity, and then a moment after that where things are stabilized by a normative relationship of marriage? So I'm just asking, within the narrative, how does the author potentially disaggregate these two moments, and how might your own reading be pushing against that disaggregation?
So yes, okay, so we get to experience Tobia's ambivalence. So I should note first that Tobia and her father are very strong Christians, but I think it's really symbolic of the highly disoriented times, or as Jonas Admas calls them, highly traveled times, that she kind of moves between different gender identities. But then, yes, it gets consolidated, or kind of a pushback to heteronormativity comes the moment they get married and everything else. Even in the book, it's not even discussed that she, you know, conceals her gender identity, and that the king continues to be attracted to her, irrespective of the fact that she appeared as male. Is never discussed. It's never discussed in the book. It's just a side note, and it's just presented as something that's strategic for that particular moment to achieve some goal, which is consolidating the Christian empire, and then it just gets erased simply. It's like a moment that flashes up and then suddenly gets removed, and more so, it gets consolidated through the marriage, and that marriage means symbolically the restoration and consolidation of the empire. So the empire, in any case, still goes back to representing heteropatriarchal and heteronormative understanding of gender relations and sexual relations, in fact. And what I try to do is just push the limits of that understanding of heteronormativity to show in Afwork's work that the way gender and sexuality are depicted are much more fluid, and irrespective of the push by the hegemonic heteronormative Christian narrative, there still exists that ambivalence and fluidity in the way, for example, the king wants to be more intimate to Tobiah. And I think there's another question for me, that's how does Tobiah help us think about gender in historic Abyssinia? I would say yes, and in the can we say gender was not understood in rigid biological terms? I think if we read closely what Tobiah tries to tell us, or what Afwork Gabriel tries to tell us, I would agree, yeah, gender was not necessarily understood in rigid biological terms, but the moment power comes with its strong discourses of heteronormativity, it kind of establishes heteronormativity and the normative gender ascriptions as the only truths and as the only realities of the time, and also of the time in which we are living now. But if we focus on lived realities and experience of ordinary citizens, past, present, then we get to see the much more complex and nuanced understanding of how gender is experienced in rather fluid and more playful than rigid terms. I think these are for now the two questions I had to respond to, and I'm not, Edom and Simi, we can continue the conversation. I'm not sure I have touched on the issue satisfactorily.
There is a question to Shimelis.
I see, yes. There is one question for me from Dr. Isaias. I can read it. So the question is about whether I concluded with a recommendation that rather than focusing on ethnic politics or any other homogenizing project, we need to sensitize and understand the complexities that put society together for a long time. So the question is whether I say that, whether that was my recommendation or conclusion. No, that was not my recommendation, but the point I was making was that the kind of national history we have today is deeply problematic. A question that you might ask about Ethiopia's history, national history, is how national is Ethiopia's national history? And we have seen this. I think Professor Taba was mentioning about this revisionist, oppositional accounts of Ethiopian history, or an understanding of Ethiopian history from a very different perspective, represented, for instance, by ethno-nationalist forces. So there is the ethno-nationalist account an accounting of Ethiopian history is very different from the mainstream established historiography of Ethiopia. What I was saying was, what we need is, in fact, at the end of my my paper, there is a section where I say what we need is a third space of enunciation, something which is contradictory and ambivalent, but also fundamentally inclusive, transcultural, transcendental in nature, as a foundation for building a new kind of Ethiopian nationalism, writing a new kind of Ethiopian national history. The history we need to write for Ethiopia is not nationalist. It doesn't have to be nationalist, but one that is national or national anti-nationalist, anti-nationalist, because the problem that we've seen is the nationalist nature. The nationalist nature, the deeply nationalist nature of Ethiopian historiography or Ethiopian historical production, the production of historical knowledge. So to write an inclusive national history in Ethiopia, we need to avoid being nationalist, or we need to be write a history, a national history, which is as much representative as possible, as much inclusive as possible. One of the critics that I was talking about, probably I did not read it during the presentation, is the idea of exceptionalism is very, very important. But at the same time, we can also move away from the idea of exceptionalism into a more generative ideas or frameworks, one of which is the idea of entanglement, the production of Ethiopia, the production of Ethiopian history through these ambivalent entanglements within the country itself, between the different groups that make up modern Ethiopia, but also ambivalent entanglement with the rest of the world, for instance, the West, which is simultaneously embraced and rejected, accepted and rejected. That kind of entanglement, a recognition of the interdependence, interconnectedness of history is important. But that does not mean that we should ignore the agonies that also make up the history, this complicated history of the Ethiopian state, of Ethiopia as a country. So my recommendation is not like I think you were talking. It's not different from the notion of the Madamar of the Prime Minister that you referred to in the chat. It's a little different. I'm not sure if I answered that question. Yeah.
Thank you, Shimelis. There's another question to all of you panelists, and it reads: if we do not attach value, judgment, good or bad, to the term exceptionalism, would it be fair to consider that each and every country, people in the world is exceptional because of the differentiating features, such as history, geography, culture, etc., that make it a distinct entity? If any of you have any input, please.
I think we also, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we also touched upon, on these particularities. We acknowledge that. And that's why, for instance, in my presentation also, I also heard it in Shimelis's presentation too, that we are not denying specific, particular histories. But when we dwell on this, it has got, ism, exceptionalism. It becomes the homogenizing, deployment of discourses. Then it creates problems. It shatters, the ways in which we attend to other kinds of lived experiences and ideas. So that's where we are coming from. And these kinds of questions even reveals the fact that we have been really suffering from epistemic bankruptcy. I mean,
We cannot move away from these kinds of things. We are only trying to show entanglements, to show chaotic relationships, to show how global capital matters, how we are connected. So that's why we are interrogating exceptionalism, and but we want to attend to specific historical material relationships. And I think there also came similar kind of question from a person called maybe Hon Mandafro Balaye. Hona Mandafro Balaye. I think well, I don't know whether he is or she is or they are. I think these people are asking that, Amhara people are being killed on the ground now. And yet you are talking about, Abyssinians, Amharas, and no. For instance, in my presentation, I was trying to say that, these are invented categories. They are discursively created. And at the same time, we should not forget that, when we say the Christian, Amhara, Tigray, political elites, culture, domination, so it does not mean that all the people, the so-called, Amhara people, go and subjugate the Oromos. No. Even, we go to the extent of critiquing the very category of Amharaness. Professor Marta Kue Kumsa says, nationalism is reductionist. So we are to unsettle that reductionism and to reveal instead complex, chaotic relationships. Yes, Amharic speaking people are being killed. Yes, Oromo language speaking Christian Oromos are also being killed. How do we account for, the lives lost due to such kinds of conflicts? So we are rather attempting, to just access those complex lived experiences. And the mundane, the everyday lived experiences. The ordinary, everyday lived experiences. That's how we can account for any kinds of, killings, lives lost during, through these killings. This is the only way, I think, or the only way, in a sense, we are, in a way, I think I am trying to bring, ways in which we can account for multiple lived experiences and envisioning multiple utopias, various kinds of aspirations, desires. We'll have opportunity, to live together by accounting for, contradictions. So that's what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Can I just briefly add a question, just to kind of stimulate the discussion in another direction, which is, I know if maybe some of you have touched on this and I missed it, which is the fact that this exceptionalism about Ethiopian history has been part of a utopia or inspiration for other movements in the diaspora. So question for you guys, if we think about Rastafarianism, if I think about Marcus Garvey in his prophetic statement, look back to Africa when a black king shall be crowned. So this kind of triggered a lot of movements, and there is also that image also contributed to a lot of solidarity by African Americans. I was wondering if you can reflect on this, because sometimes these images, whether you call it like rallying around it, could be part of this, some sort of a strategic essentialism or utopianism that can sometimes help. Haile Selassie was like demonized within Ethiopia, responsible for hunger. Students are demonstrating against him, and then he arrives in Jamaica, and he himself, I think, was shocked by the reception. So there is that aspect of it, of Rastafarianism, which end up being part of the decolonization type of thinking. Bob Marley is the greatest example of that.
Yeah, I think it's, we need to say a few words about Professor Salah's question. I think absolutely I agree with you. I mean, the idea of exceptionalism is particularly its place. This narrative of exceptionalism is place in the subaltern cultural political imaginations in the outside of Ethiopia. I mean, it's the role these idea of exceptionalism played in the global anti-colonial imperial struggles, where communities of color, particularly black people living in Africa and in different parts of the African continent, but also across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, in the US, were organized around the very idea of Ethiopia, because that idea of Ethiopia represents this idea of freedom, an idea of freedom, a kind of a beacon of independence, an example of black dignity. I mean, there are, you mentioned examples of Pan-Africanism. There is an unmistakable bond, a very powerful bond between Ethiopia on the one hand and movements like Rastafarianism or Ethiopianism, Pan-Africanism, Afrocentrism on the other. So when we talk about exceptionalism, I think all of us probably made it very clear, abundantly clear in the presentation, that it's not a rejection. It's not an outright rejection of this very idea, this very important idea of exceptionalism. The point we were making is to be critical of this idea in a way that can help us understand Ethiopia, especially in terms of helping us ask questions that are often glossed over. For instance, in the discussions about political economy, questions, the critical fundamental economic questions of poverty and development are questions that have been not abandoned, but not been critically questioned and interrogated in Ethiopia. These kind of questions are very important, especially in modern Ethiopia, in contemporary Ethiopia. So there is an argument, a powerful argument that one can make for the idea of exceptionalism, partly as in terms of recognizing the very complicated historical constitution of Ethiopia, a result of this coming together of influences from different parts of the world, producing an identity that is distinct in many ways from other regions of the world and also other parts of the African continent. But at the same, so there is, you can make an argument for that. You can also make an argument for using the idea of exceptionalism in terms of its political potential, the potential to mobilize groups, as it has done in the past, like the Pan-Africanism or the Rastafarianism we talked about. But I think it is time. I think the point was to make a critical engagement. There is a need for urgency for a critical conversation with the notion of exceptionalism. The notion of exceptionalism needs to be critically interrogated to allow for a new kind of political intellectual imagination as a way out of the political conundrum that Ethiopia finds itself today. I think that's so that's my take on that question. The rest, if you can.
If I may be allowed, Professor Shimalis.
Yes.
When Emperor Haile Selassie visited Ethiopia, America, in 1954, just a week before this Brown versus Verso litigation, that it's the fact that, he's coming in 1954, representing probably largely, by then there were only very few independent countries. So he was representing not only Ethiopia, but the entire Africa, 1954. Historically, that's very significant. So people, there are a number of, not a lot, but probably one or two works now that are trying to investigate the impact of the coming of the emperor in 1954. They try to connect that to what extent or to what degree that has galvanized it, the ongoing civil rights movement. It is a subject that needs to be explored critically, but it's very important. My point is, Haile Selassie, that diminutive figure, as you know him, he was representing a nation. He was representing all these things that we are discussing. A nation, tied with this exceptionalism. He was not just, he was not just representing himself. He was representing a history and a nation. We're talking about that. So I'm glad that this subject is, considered. I hope Fukru who is going to address that. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it. I would have been one of those presenting this subject, but I couldn't make it. But in any case, this is a very important issue. It's a very important topic.
Yeah.
If Sarawet, do you want to add something or?
I would like to add a couple of words, maybe in reflection or reflecting on what Elizabeth and Fukru asked. I mean, it's not that I have an answer for that. It's a shared question, and I think all of us here are struggling with that question. But I'm like, these are some thoughts that I deeply struggle with, and I thought maybe I'd just forward them here. I think most of what's going on now reminds of Said's idea of the role of the public intellectual in a way. What is it that we do, and what kind of role can we assume, and what kind of position can we also take when we are faced with such complex problem that's highly tied to our history, but then we're faced with so much complex problems that are affecting the everyday experience of ordinary citizens. So how do we be a part of something that brings about change? So I was thinking, as one of the things, for example, we learn from Said's role as opposition as a public intellectual is his moral consistency, and how do we think about that? And there's a question of empathy also that we seem to forget when we position ourselves in either extreme. We don't seem to try and understand the historical experience of those who make claims, because we don't sympathize, or we don't have the courage itself to listen to those experiences, because we just trust too much what we have believed is the only truth. And I think that's one problem that we need to reflect on, at least those of us who can have a conversation of sorts. And I believe there is a need for a very seriously engaged national dialogue that takes into account the material conditions of people who struggle to make needs met, and then there is also a need to account for what I think Surafel and I talk about this a lot, and there's a need to think actively about how global capital makes use of all this skirmish and conflict we have, and we need to think about that. We need, every time we think about anything that's locally located and embedded, we need to take into account those histories and the ways in which capital moves, and the ways in which capital manipulates these moments of internal tension and conflict. And I think maybe there's a need to think about new ways of organizing, and this is but a struggle and about which we have to think together, and we have to kind of, perhaps one of the forums could be this one, to imagine a shared possibility and an alternative future out of the tension and contradictions in which we are living at the moment. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I'm so sorry, Professor Tibebe, that we have to end it here, because also Professor Baham Zoidi is joining us from Addis. So,
Okay.
And is the keynote speaker. So we're going to get out of this panel and but I promise one thing, there were other like wonderful questions, and our colleague Elizabeth Georges wanted to also intervene.
I have to say something, Salah. Just 1 minute, 1 minute.
But we are going to be delayed. It's already the time to join the other panel.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, thank you.